We are live. All right. It's going to get very uncomfortable here very soon. It's pretty warm in here.
Yeah.
I guess we'll go ahead and start without Kinsey and Eddie. They might walk in here a little late. It's totally fine. All right, so what I wanted to do, I like doing this every semester at the end of the semester because, film history, this is a class that I've taught 3 times already. And, in the future, I'll probably teach it again. So I always like getting feedback from students about things that you like, things that you would change if you could, because obviously my goal is always to make this class better, right? I really genuinely enjoy getting feedback from students. I know it's kind of weird getting feedback. Usually I get feedback from the entire class, but there's 3 people in a class of 40. So, once again, like and subscribe. But if you want to comment on the YouTube video and tell me things that you enjoyed about this class, things that you did not enjoy about this class, feel free to do that. But I'll just open it up to you guys. What are some things that we'll start off with, what are the things that you liked about this class that I should keep for if I teach this class again?
I like the in-person.
Okay.
I definitely like the in-person for sure. And I think you were smart about how you're giving people but the option to stay online if they want it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was good. You were flexible, and that flexibility, especially during these times, that's probably one of the best things about this for sure.
It is interesting for the people who are here saying that they enjoyed the face-to-face element. I'm curious what the people online, if they felt like that they also enjoyed that it was flexible online, they could do everything online, or what. So there's really no way for me to know that, which is one very frustrating element about this particular semester is I really have no relationship with the majority of your class.
Mm-hmm.
Like I have a relationship with you 5, and that's pretty much it, right? So it's kind of a frustrating element. But anything else?
I like the structure of this class a lot, like with the notes and the PowerPoints, and I feel like things are very easy to find, which that's not the case for like a lot of other classes.
Yeah.
And like assuming if there were like more assignments, like apart from exams, I'm sure those would also be like fairly easy to find.
Yeah, and that actually is something that I learned I took an online teaching class. I think it was called like Masters of Online Teaching. And one of the things that they talked about in this class was what they call the deconstructed syllabus, where you have your syllabus essentially deconstructed into individual segments. That way it's easy for you to find various chapters or whatever. I mean, this class is pretty easy to there he is, Kinsey. How you doing, Kinsey?
Good.
Good to have you, like always. I like the, what do you got, like a green, what do you look like, a track jacket? What do you call that?
Tracksuit.
Tracksuit, right?
Yeah.
Looking like you're about to go run a marathon. But good to have you in here. I will say I like the mask. It seems like the mask is going with the tracksuit.
It's like the white on
You're
white.
matching a little bit. Excellent. But yeah, so the deconstructed syllabus is something they kind of teach in terms of making it easy for students to find what they need to find. So that is something that I don't want to take complete credit for that because that is something that I learned. GSU was running that class.
Well, no, that's good. One thing about your syllabus, it's very easy to follow.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these teachers' syllabus is just all over the place. My one teacher has like all of her like stuff's highlighted in blue, so it's really difficult to read, and I don't know what's important because everything's highlighted in blue. So your syllabus is like really easy. You're like, okay, this day we're doing this section subject, this subject, this subject.
And I find I tend to be very organized in my planning. So that a lot of that has to do with it's sort of self-serving too for me because I like having knowing exactly what I'm covering this class. It's like, oh yeah, this is the class where I'm covering whatever. Then I can find my notes, and it's very easy for me to connect those two and everything. So it also helps me as well. And one of the things I want to do this semester, especially because of the pandemic, is usually I don't post my teaching notes online, but this semester obviously I did that. I'm probably just going to do that every semester, just have those teaching notes online. I think that also helps in terms of like classroom discussion rather than me just, regurgitating what's in the textbook, you know, I like that sometimes students have read it beforehand, and we can be more of a discussion. The class is teaching, everyone's teaching each other, rather than me just teaching the class. All right, so let's talk about things that you would want to change. So obviously this is not going to hurt my feelings. So if there's something that you would preferred in terms of the way the classroom is organized, or the way the particular assignments that we had. Obviously in this class there's only 3 assignments, right? But I'm interested to hear what you guys, if you would change anything, what that change would be. Once again, if you're watching online, you want to comment on the comments, just to let me know, get some feedback. Anything in particular?
It's a terrible teacher, awful job.
Right, yeah.
Honestly, I don't have any complaints. Like, this is my favorite class, how you structured it, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will say this has been like the best class I've had this semester, just because everything else is so like hectic and strict.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like a class where I can actually breathe in.
One thing that what I was concerned with, I was afraid that students wouldn't like that there's only 3 assignments in the class, because I can see students complain about, if I do poorly on one exam, then I'm pretty much done for the semester.
That was actually one thing I was worried about, but then I did good on the first exam, second exam, so it's like, okay, I'm not going to.
I think a lot of it has to do with my exams are too easy. I mean, I think that's clear. My exams are way too easy. But that's not, my goal is not to, make my class incredibly difficult for students, so, that was, but yeah. Anything else? Anything you would change, Kinsey, about this class?
The lack of getting in person is like kind of, I don't know, like people in the class.
Yeah.
It's a little weird.
I almost feel like it would be better if it was, obviously during a pandemic you can't control it, but all face-to-face or all synchronous, like online. I feel like it would be better either way, rather than this sort of limbo that we're sort of in right now. But yeah, I can most certainly, because I've had a couple of grad classes online, and they were synchronous, right? And grad classes, they're very discussion based, so we're all talking with each other, taking turns and everything, and I felt like, that works out pretty well. I felt like it wasn't, too bad. So if I could replicate that somehow.
Yeah, actually, I'm taking a GFA class this semester, and what they do is that, so they have the group that goes in that week in person, and then they have everyone else online, like on a video call. And the professor will talk to in person and the people online, and so everybody will answer questions or be part of the discussion. So you might try that next semester.
One thing that I talked to Rohan and Bill about this during my media theory classes. I'm thinking about scheduling 5 Zoom sessions, video call sessions, and if you show up on those days, you get 1 extra credit towards your final grade. So if you show up for all 5, you get 5 percentage points on your final grade. So it's a pretty big incentive for showing up, because if we do a Zoom call, I want people to show up and I want them to participate. Because what I don't want to happen is I'll do that Zoom call and I'm just talking to a bunch of screens, like blank screens. That is something that I do not want to do. But yeah. All right, so let's move on. So today we're talking about the developing world, right? So this chapter is pretty long, and it has a lot of information, a lot of films, a lot of dates, a lot of history. It covers a lot of countries that we consider that this book labels as the developing world, right? And there's way too much information to cover in a lecture. So I had to be very selective on what I was covering. So what I did was I focused on 3 countries: Africa, Iran, and India. So I focused on 3 particular countries. So essentially what I did is I left out a bunch that's in the textbook. So if you focus on those 3, Africa, Iran, and India, you're fine. You can skip all the others. And that doesn't mean that I feel like these are better films or whatever. I chose these because we really have not talked about these countries at all this whole semester. So I chose the ones that we haven't really talked about yet. So we haven't talked about African film at all. We haven't talked about Indian film, which we probably should have. I mean, there's probably previous chapters where we could have dived into like the formation of Bollywood, which we really didn't get into. And of course, we didn't talk about Iranian film at all. So I wanted to focus on those three particular countries because we don't have the time to cover them all. So when you're studying, focus on those when you're studying, and you should be fine. All right, so I think it's also important for me to state that this is not my wheelhouse. This chapter is not my wheelhouse, right? So we're talking about African cinema, we're talking about Iranian cinema and Indian cinema, not my wheelhouse. I do not know much about these types of films. Many of the stuff that I learned when I read this textbook. So if it seems like I'm just regurgitating what it says in the textbook, I kind of really am in a lot of ways. But I read the textbook, and then I kind of dove deeper in some of these films and everything. So there is something that we can get out of this particular lesson. What I didn't want to do is I didn't want to say, well, I don't really know much about this. Let's just skip this chapter. Obviously, I didn't want to do that either. So that's kind of where we're at right now. So let me ask you this. What is the developing world? What does that mean? Yes?
Oh, okay. It's basically a bunch of third world countries that like recently gained their independence and they're slowly developing, but they're not really, they're still very young and unstable.
Yeah, so I think you say a couple important qualities there, or characteristics of the developing world. The first thing is they're countries that are recently independent countries. So most developing world countries were at one point colonies of the West, right? So a lot of times we look at these developing countries and there's like this negative stigma that they're less than, right? They're less economically sound, often have political turmoil, often corruption in their governments, famine, disease, and we kind of look down on these countries, but a lot of times we neglect to look at the fact that many of the problems that these countries have really is our fault. Right? It really is. Like it's the manifestations, it's the consequences of colonialism and sort of injecting ourselves, when I say our, I mean like Western culture, for the United States and Western Europe, on these countries, like erasure of their culture, right, disrupting their values and their ideology. So once again, it's important to recognize that because this also often manifests in film in these countries as well. Good. All right. Also, the characteristics of the developing world, which you said, it's very important that these are countries that are in transition. They're in a cultural and industrial transition. So many times there's this tension between tradition, the old way of doing things, and modernity, right? This new industrial influence from the West, embrace of capitalism, right? So you're seeing that tension that often manifests in films as well. Which leads us to our next question. Describe the common themes that appear in films in the developing world. Kind of already alluded to one of those, and that one of the themes is this tension between modernity, progress, and tradition and culture. And these often butt heads in film. What else? What are some other themes in these films? Yes?
Well, I was gonna say like political themes about depending on where it's at, like dictatorships.
Yeah.
Kind of what's honestly kind of what you said, what's going on in the country right now, the unstability of the country, the economies, themes like that.
Yeah, exactly. So this social critique, political critique often manifests in these films. Definitely. Describe how films in these countries were inspired by Western filmmaking. I think the obvious example is Bollywood. I think you can see how sort of like embracing this idea of big budgets, of classic like love triangles and love stories and that sort of thing. If you want to say that like maybe like the musicals influence on these types of films, certainly. What else? Many of these films it sort of embrace young cinemas. So for example, neorealism, French New Wave, young cinema, that sort of thing. And you see those manifesting in these films as well. What do you know about Bollywood?
They're all very soap opera-esque,
Yeah.
very musical and bombastic, I guess.
Yeah, when we usually think like the stereotypical image in your head when you think of Bollywood is like the flashy like numbers, musical numbers, dance sequences that seem to like just come manifest out of nowhere in the middle of the film, right? Kind of like a musical, so like a more bombastic musical in a lot of ways, right? And then of course you might think of those YouTube videos that always are viral, where it's like the most insane action scene you've ever seen, like those videos that are all surfacing all the time now.
Very over dramatic.
Yeah.
Very, all out.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to talk a little bit about Bollywood. Unfortunately, we didn't have time in previous chapters to talk about sort of like the formation of Bollywood, but we'll kind of talk about it a little bit in Indian cinema. All right, here we go. Reading off my notes. This is fun. So let's talk about the developing world and sort of like third world economics. So economists began to describe this region as a developing world because they saw it as sort of booms in the economy, or those slight booms in the economy, but also sort of this embrace of industrialization and this idea that they're sort of behind everybody else. Like they're sort of in terms of like their evolution, they're behind. Life expectancy and literacy had increased, earnings were growing, and the green revolution and agriculture practices had expanded food productivity. Right, so Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea grew prosperous quickly through industrialization and investment in information technology. So you're seeing these drastic growths of the industry in these countries. Like I said before, my focus will be primarily or solely on Africa, Iran, and India. So virtually all these countries that we consider to be the developing world or the developing countries were once colonized by the West. The world recession in the early 1980s intensified financial problems. There was hunger riots, government corruption, population was expanding quickly. There was often, civil war or wars between different countries during this time period, political changes, the effects of communism and capitalism, sort of that tension between those two elements as well. HIV virus and other diseases during this time period as well. So let's talk about new cinemas and new audiences. So in the 1960s, as film going was declining in the West, remember we talked about this in the 1960s where less and less people were watching film, and there's other competing elements in terms of like television and amusement parks and that sort of thing. And then also we talked about what's often called the white flight. So people who were leaving the suburbs, were leaving the cities to the suburbs, right? Which was affecting the film industry in a negative way. The reverse was happening often in the developing world. So rather than people leaving the city, people were flowing to the city, right? Leaving the rural areas and going to the city. So you're seeing these growing populations all sort of gravitating to the urban sprawls. This leads to a big boost in the film industry, where the film industry became very popular. It didn't really have a lot of competition. Moving on. All right, so let's talk about African cinema. So out of all the third world regions, Africa by far remained the most underdeveloped. After the 1980s, the 30 poorest countries in the world, 25 were in Africa. Most African countries did not produce a feature-length film before the mid-1970s. So once again, film was just not prominent in Africa until around the 1970s. African filmmakers moved towards international cooperation, meaning that you needed money to make films, so you needed to find some way of financing your films. And one way was the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers. This was an association of 30 countries, which aimed to promote African film industry, to promote culture and that sort of thing, sort of fighting back against the influence of Hollywood as well, but sort of just to encourage independent filmmakers in Africa. And most in these regions, in the developing world, had to be financed by either the government or through some of these associations. Yes?
I just say, fun fact, I have a friend, Lewis, he works for the CDC, and I've worked on him with a couple of film productions before. He has a film production company in Africa.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent, awesome. So let's talk about a couple of filmmakers. So, Simbene, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, but you may recognize that name because he directed, we talked about one of the films that he directed, Black Girl. We showed a scene from that film. This is the same director. I want to mention another one of his films. This one, I believe it's pronounced Mulade. And Mulade is a film that is centered around female genital mutilation, which it was like a cultural practice in African countries during the time. And this paints this tradition as sort of like very negatively. So it shows, the story centers around a woman who takes in these girls and she defends the girls from having female genital mutilation by using mulade, which is like, magical, like, magic, right? And it's like this depiction of like the tension between tradition and modernity and progression. So I want to show a scene from that film. Go ahead and hit those lights for me, kids there.
Bachiri.
Traore.
Nse. Bachiri.
Ba.
Bachiri.
Si.
Alo tu kanya ni nga mama boy de la wi.
O bɛ fɛn dɔ de ɲini bɛnkɛ ko tɛ fana o bɛ maaw de kunna.
All right, that was live. Up next on the list here is The Winds of Orange. I believe that's how you pronounce, but it's a depiction of war-torn Algeria. Here is a scene from that film. up next, I believe you pronounce this Poos Poos. It's a film in 1976. This film is, let me pull up my notes here. It's a comedy. Filmmaker who studied film in Paris and France. A recurring theme of tradition versus modernity, collective values versus individualism. Many of the directors grew up watching American cinema, and their films are a dynamic interaction between Western filmmaking conventions, explorations of African aesthetic tradition. But this is Poos Poos.
Alors, t'aimes bien. Elle serait une bonne épouse pour toi.
Allez, c'est droit.
Et tu devrais te dépêcher parce que celle-là, elle ne va pas traîner longtemps.
Alright. Moving on to Iranian cinema. So a little bit of a history lesson for you. In 1979, a revolt drove the Shah, or the king, and his dynasty out of Iran. The Ayatollah, Khomeini, took over the government and the country became a theocracy. The country was attacked by Iraq, which led by Saddam Hussein. The war split the Arab states and was costly to Iran. Khomeini leadership was shaken and Saddam had gained stature. After the revolution, many filmmakers went into exile and film production slacked. Only 100 feature films were made between 1979 and 1985. There was censorship, particularly on sexual display and other like Western influences. Khomeini financed filmmaking that reflected his interpretation of Iranian culture and the Shiite Muslim religion. The regime encouraged a new generation of filmmakers. Women eventually had the opportunity to be directors and were allowed to produce films. Many of Iran's most talented directors turned to stories centered on young people. Foreign films were cut, I'm supposed to say foreign, or banned altogether. There was a strict censorship was reinstated, so there was these moments of sort of like call it like a thawing of censorship, and then strict censorship reinstated. I want to show a couple of films here, or scenes from films. The first one, this one translates to The Cow. So The Cow, the film is about a man who really loves his cow, and the cow ends up dying, and the villager, the rest of the town, rather than telling him that his cow died, they continually lie to him because they're afraid of what that will do to him if he finds out his cow is dead. And the guy ends up kind of just going crazy throughout the whole film. So this is a scene from The Cow.
والا مشتی من که نه مشت هستم. اسلام دروغ نگفته. اینی هم که گفته گاه به در رفته راست.
باب من که در نمیره که از خدا. آخه اگه در بره کجا میتونه بره؟
گاه به تو در رفته مشتی. مشت حسن، تو که خودت صبح رفتی تمیله رو دیدی برادر من. آخه من که به تو دروغ نگفتم بابا.
باب من همینجا.
اگه گاوت همینجا تو تمیله است پس چرا نمیری پیشه؟ خب برو تو تمیله پیش گاوت دیگه. آره بابا برو پیش گاوت دیگه. راست میگه مشتی.
من اینجا نشستم
مواظب چی؟
امشب رویا دست به یکی کردم میخوام بیام گاو منو بدزدم.
از کجا میدونه این؟
Alright, that was the cow. Up next, Through the Olive Trees. This film is set in sort of an earthquake-ravaged northern Iran. A complex study of the link between art and life. The narrative often blurs the boundaries between fiction and reality. This film is noteworthy for its beautiful shots. This is Through the Olive Trees. We have one more films. All right, so our next film is The Blackboard. I believe it's The Blackboard, not Blackboards. But mostly non-actors were used to portray an unemployed teacher on the road near the Iraqi border. He's struggling to educate some of the refugees who are often too concerned with just staying alive. Right? And here is a clip from Blackboards.
Kulkas. Kaunches.
Hayas.
Ha?
Hayas.
Hayas. تو ابن روجتي تبرقوا تشتري حسي أبارك الله بردو تو سويتس
لا
حظك سوات بيبي
لا
أزاني سوات بتشتري درجة خوا تو تاني سوات بيبي بريد كتب بخواني روزنامة بخواني بشي ترقة قصة بكي قصة بيوتش كبي أما سوات بدل دوا خواتك تو كتب تاني بخواني تاني داستانيش بخواني
داستان صدق داستان زين البحر باير شوار رفقا حيوان ما برحا وسر كده تاق حيوان ما دورنا خاص خاصة تاق البان مولا وهبرش ما هركد إرا ما كد إلى أولا رمنا ما برما رمنا ما إنما رمنا ثمانية تاق رفقا كم جيرتش تاق هي خاص خاصة عزيتش كلماتو باصرش برمات لا باصرش نبرمي جناح ماتو نبابا هين عزيت شكل مسرش برمي ماتو لا بر جناح شيء ماكو حل عزيت شكل تا أمارة واردس مريا حل برش نلاو قركش بسرش برمات وكره منها كم يا جناح حال سرش مبر تاگەرەکش بەسەرش بڕ دەست نەبەرم داوەلوە ئەچاکە دەست کرد دژماندای بەم لێوا گرت چۆ تم ئەویشاشا گرت چاوە چاکە سەرەشا بڕی پاکشا کرد و هین ئاشا گۆشتەکەشا پاک کرد و کوتە کوتەشا کرد چاکە ئاشا بەش و منشا نەیارینە بەش و منشا نەیاریە ئەتر ئەچاکە منی چلوانی ئەو لاوە گواری ژەرەشی هڕ کردی منی چیوەم گرتە بەش و ئایشان نەی منی چاگە ئەتر حیوان چی و ماجیا کردەوە جەنگ مابی پاسە ئەتر دێرش کرد سەیپڕ ئەتر ئەمان ئەپاو بێنێ ئامان مێوێ ئەتر ئامان مێوە پیانێ
سەوات گەرەک نێفەسێ بڵێ داسان چێژی بوومان بێژم سەوات بێژم بێ سەکە
ئەقا جەنەبال بزەحمەت وەربێنە تەشتی وەرە بێنە
That was blackboards. All right, up next, all I have a trailer for this film. This is Offside. This is a 2006 film, so we're skipping ahead here. That's one of the the negatives of teaching a particular chapter on the developing world, because then you lump in all of these films from different time periods. But right here, 2006. It's about girls who try to watch a World Cup match but are forbidden by law because of their gender. Female fans are not allowed to enter football stadiums in Iran on the grounds that there's high risk of violence and verbal abuse. But here is the trailer for Offside.
میتونم برم
حالا گیریم که باید برم چجوری میخوای از دست اینا بریم
اگه اینا جایی بریم نمازه چی دست آمدن داره چشمم
چیز دیواره دستشوی نبینی
چی نبینم؟
دیواره دستشوی چرا دست بسته دختر بابا
بشین سرکار
چه احترامی برو تو باش برو تو
بابا ایمن
پس چرا تو بازی ژاپن که تو همین استادیوم هم بود زنده ژاپنی اومدن نشستن فوتبال دیدن
درون ژاپن
All right, that was Offside. All right, so moving on to India. So India had really no need for Hollywood's investment, so cinema was India's 5th largest industry and its principal form of popular culture. There was an international market for Indian films, expanding during the 1970s, drawing audiences from Russia, Indonesia. In 1970, there was a border war with Pakistan. There's civil unrest, riots, assassinations, terrorist attacks, and we're not even going to get into issues of the various different ethnicities in India and religious turmoil and tension that happens in India. In 1970s, new trends emerged influenced by U.S. and Western cinema, more violence, eroticism, action-oriented productions. One film I want to show is a film called, I believe it's pronounced Sholay, or Flames of the Sun. This depicts a particular genre film called the dacoity film. I believe that's how you pronounce it, I'm not 100% sure. But the sort of like the criminal film. This film is about 2 outlaws hired by a retired police officer to capture another criminal. So the Sholay cut down a number of song sequences, which is typical of Indian films, replacing them with gunfights, I should say. Blended the tradition of the outlaw film with the spaghetti western. And this film is called Sholay. Here's the scene.
Kaliha. Kya samajh kar aaye the? कि सरदार बहुत खुश होगा, शाबाशी देगा क्यों? धिक्कार है। अरे ओ सांभा, कितना इनाम रखे है सरकार हम पर?
पूरे 50,000।
सुना? पूरे 50,000। और ये इनाम इसलिए है कि यहाँ से 50-50 कोस दूर गांव में जब बच्चा रात को रोता है तो माँ कहती है बेटे सो जा नहीं तो गब्बर सिंह आ जाएगा। और ये 3 हरामजादे ये गब्बर सिंह का नाम पूरा मिट्टी में मिला दिए। इसकी सजा मिलेगी, बराबर मिलेगी। कितनी गोली है इसके अंदर? हाँ? कितनी गोली है?
6 सरदार।
6 गोली। 6 गोली है इसका अंदर। 6 गोली और आदमी 3। बहुत नाइंसाफी है ये। अब ठीक।
Up next, we have, we'll do parallel cinema. So parallel cinema, in the late 1960s, the government encouraged the Film Finance Corporation to shift its support from commercial fare towards low-budget art cinema. So this idea that sort of financing more art cinema, that sort of thing, created a sense of quality film culture, quiet social commentary influenced by Italian neorealism, European cinemas. Refusing the formula of popular cinema, the new films depended on government financing, but problems would soon arise from this. There were censors that clamped down on many directors, political dissent was discouraged. There was really no established venue for these screenings, but many of these films were financed through parallel cinemas and the Film Finance Corporation. One of those films I'm going to show is a film called The Turing, in 1976. It's a tale of rural milk cooperative movement. So in the 1970s, a little history for you. In the 1970s, India went from sort of a milk deficient country to the world's largest milk producer. So there's a huge growth in the amount of milk production. They depicted the power of like sort of a collective might. This film was entirely crowdfunded by 500,000 farmers. All right. So this film, The Churning, and where is it? And here it is. learning. As a former firefighter, I want to recommend that do not throw sand on a fully involved house fire. It's not going to work. Although I'm sure that it's meant to depict like the hopelessness of it, like just like this is their everything and they're losing it, so they just want to do something other than just watch them sit around. All right, so our final clip for today is from a film. It's a great example of the masala genre. So the masala genre is it's your stereotypical idea of what a Bollywood film is, right? So you got musical numbers mixed in with dancing, mixed in with melodramas, that sort of thing. So think of it as like a musical. But this film, I believe it's pronounced, I'm not even sure how to pronounce this, so I'm not even going to try it.
Yadon ki bada.
There you go, I like it, excellent. But I actually get a kick. I actually really like this particular scene. So the film is about three brothers who, when they're young, their mom teaches them a song, right? They sing the song together. And then they witness a robbery or a murder or something like that, and then the criminal family has their parents killed. The brothers lose contact with each other or are lost. You know, they lose each other. And then they eventually find each other again. And that's at the conclusion of the film, and this is what we're going to see, this particular scene. But here it is.
जी भी सुनीता अभी तक नहीं है। आप खाने में जैसे तक ही जैसे ही वो आई मैं उन्हें बता दूंगा कि आप अंदर आ चुके हैं। थैंक यू। हेलो। Is something wrong? कुछ नहीं।
नीचे तक, यहाँ से सड़कों तक 40 किलो हो रहे हैं और निशाना सिर्फ एक सर और इनाम 25,000।
थैंक यू सो मच लेडीज एंड जेंटलमैन। इससे पहले कि मैं आज का प्रोग्राम पेश करूं, मैं आपको एक 15 साल पुराना गाना सुनाता हूं, इस प्रार्थना के साथ कि मेरी आवाज उन कानों तक पहुंच जाए जो कभी ये गाना मेरे साथ गाते थे, मेरे अपने भाई। यादों की बारात निकली है आज दिल के द्वारे, दिल के द्वारे। यादों की बारात निकली है आज दिल के द्वारे, दिल के द्वारे। सपनों की शहनाई बीते दिलों को पुकारे, दिल के द्वारे। ओ छेड़ो तराने मिलन के प्यारे प्यारे संग हमारे। बदले ना अपना ये आलम कभी, जीवन में बिछड़ेंगे ना हम कभी। ओ बदले ना अपना ये आलम कभी, जीवन में बिछड़े हम कभी यूं भी जाओगे आखिर कहाँ होगे हमारे यादों की बारात निकली है आज दिल के द्वारे सपनों की शहनाई बीते दिनों को पुकारे दिल के द्वारे आगे भी होगा जो उसका करम ये दिन तो मनाएंगे हर साल हम अपने आंगन नाचे गाएंगे चंदा सितारे यादों की बारात निकली है आज दिल के द्वारे सपनों की शहनाई बीते दिनों को पुकारे दिल के द्वारे
All right, that's a great example of how you really don't need a translation to know exactly what's happening in that particular scene. All right, very good. So that's all I have for today. That was the developing world. On Thursday, our last class, we're going to be talking about the rise and fall of Hollywood. That'll be our last chapter. And that obviously we'll have Thanksgiving break. We will not be coming back after Thanksgiving break. You just have that one exam to take. I believe it's December 7th is when it closes. So you have plenty of time to finish that exam. Any questions about anything? They're going to be here for our last day on Thursday. Celebration's going to be partying here.
Of course.
Let me know. All right, that's all I have. Have a good one, everybody.